like to talk about is social service as an agent of mission in British Methodism in the 1890s and 1900s. The roots of this paper lie in an article arising out of a conference in Oxford in 1996 on Wesleyan theology for today, and that appeared in a Westminster College publication. In it, I sought to trace the development of Methodist work amongst the poor, from John Wesley to William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army. And I set it in the context of the interaction of religion and urbanization, the growth of towns and cities in 19th century Britain. I concluded with a sketch of the work of a towering figure in the development of what he himself called social Christianity. And the person I'm talking about is Hugh Price Hughes, the architect and inspiration of the forward music and movement and the creation of central halls in many of our cities and towns in Britain at the end of the 19th century. So I looked at the work of Hugh Price Hughes and then his legacy, particularly through the lens of the work of three of his disciples, namely Samuel Keble, a leading light in the development of the Wesleyan Union of Social Service, which I'm going to talk about later, J.E. Rattenbury, who continued Hugh Price Hughes's work at the West London Mission, and John Scott Lidgett, the founder of the Bermondsey settlement, also in London, south of the river. Hugh Price Hughes's forward movement was the last flowering of the so-called nonconformist conscience, with the creation of the missions and central halls that many of us remember if they're not still alive and working today. They were a response to the challenges of the cities, quote, to provide centers of evangelism and social amelioration, the sacrament and the soup ladle hand in hand. So in this short talk, I want to pick out some of the major points from that period, 1890 to 1914, featuring the work of the Wesleyan and then briefly the Primitive Methodists in making social service a major part of their home mission program. You see, this was an era of optimism of the role of social service as then redefined to deliver what they called the kingdom of God on earth. In part, it was relying on a reinterpretation of the work of John Wesley himself, the founder of Methodism, or one of the co-founders, the centenary of whose death in 1891 spawned a number of scholarly reflections informing the zeal of Methodists to recapture that early primitive passion for reaching out to the poor and the unchurched. The official history of Methodism in 1909 captured this new view thus. Wesley anticipated almost all forms of social work now carried on. If he was not a theoretical socialist, he was a self-denying, practical philanthropist who gave a new and abiding impulse to social reform, end of quote. The Liberal Party landslide of the 1906 British general election was the apogee, the height of the political nonconformity, with a record number of free church, that's non-Anglican, MPs elected, raising hopes of the delivery of many of the social service aspirations of Methodists for a fairer and more just society. That has a resonance today, as the Methodist Church only at its last conference committed itself to be a justice-seeking church. So we can look back to this period as the origins of maybe where we are today. But as the Liberal government ran into difficulties with its social reform agenda, opposed by the conservative forces of the upper House of Lords, so some Methodists became disenchanted with Lloyd George, one of the leading figures of the Liberal Party, and political nonconformity became moribund, and many transferred their loyalties to the rising Labour Party, which was, in the words of John Munsey Turner, my beloved late superintendent from the Halifax circuit, in his view, it was the product of a secularization of evangelical Arminianism, of Methodism's religious idealism. And of course, as has been said often enough, the Labour Party owed more to Methodism than it owed to Marx. So let's look at Wesleyan Methodism and social service. Discussion of the place of labour and the use of time in industrial Britain hardened in the 19th century into debates about the morality of work and its rewards, about the ethics of labour, the exploitation of workers, issues neglected in a Methodism dominated, but in the earlier part of the century, by the prevailing social thought of evangelicalism, which persisted throughout most of the century. So while much valuable work has been done in recent years on a reassessment of the place of Wesleyan Methodist businessmen's influence in politics, commerce, and industry in the heyday of Victorian and Edwardian Britain, there hasn't been so much done on attitudes of poverty towards poverty and wealth, work and wages from within the church establishment, or an investigation of how ministers were shaping or reflecting social and political attitudes. In this, one particular contribution of a pivotal figure, Samuel Keble, 1853 to 1947, needs to be recognised. His mentor was Hugh Price Hughes, a Wesleyan revivalist, but less clearly a Christian socialist, creating the environment in which the Wesleyan Methodist Union of Social Service emerged, through which Keble was able to channel much of his energies in the promotion of social issues, including those of work and labour. And it's his contribution that I want to highlight. Those who emphasise the social service element of Methodism and its attitudes to work and labour, of course, looked to their founder, John Wesley, as an inspiration. Methodists gathering at the first conference of the Wesleyan Methodist Union for Social Service in 1909, meeting in Oxford, claimed their place in the apostolic succession, quote, of those Oxford men who visited the sick and those in prison and who preached the gospel to the poor. They were reclaiming a radical concern for social reconstruction by rediscovering Wesley, who had said that Christianity is essentially a social religion in defense of the poor and in attack on those who exploited them and misused wealth. The later involvement of some Methodists, albeit more non-Wesleyans, in the trade union movement, particularly amongst the Primitive Methodists, and in Chartism and radical politics, was cited by them as a response, the response of authentic Wesleyan, that is, deriving from Wesley, Methodism, to the concerns of the urban poor and the growing working class proletariat. It was, if you like, a fusion of evangelical proclamation and social action, challenging the fatalism of Calvinism. Nigel Scotland sees such Methodist involvement as endowing the labouring classes with a heightened social awareness, a strong sense of justice, manifested in the strength of the themes of brotherhood, the priesthood of all believers, and social justice, in an affirmation of spiritual and social equality. And it's important to recognise that it was not an either or, it was a both and. From those with Wesley's radical social conscience, and with the influence of F.T. Morris and the Christian socialists, emerged the charismatic figure of Hugh Price Hughes, who in 1884 proclaimed, "The great need of our time is for Christian socialism." Arthur Porritt called him the Day of Judgment in Breeches, as a measure of his notoriety. In 1889, he founded a new and radical work in the West London Mission, still alive and at work today, the exemplar of much subsequent Methodist social action, focusing often on the provision of work and gainful employment in wholesome activities off the streets. And of course, we know all the whole range of ways in which that was expressed in labour exchanges, in provision for the most vulnerable women and children, for educational services, for health services, all these things that contributed to social service. He thus reclaimed the cities of England as targets of a more aggressive Christian evangelism through the creation of central halls as part of the so-called forward movement. A characteristic statement which epitomizes his whole approach is found in the collection of his sermons, Social Christianity, published in that same year, 1889. Christ came to save the nation as well as the individual. It is an essential feature of his mission to reconstruct society on the basis of justice and love. But this did not lead Hughes to espouse the political aspects of the emerging socialist movement in Britain. Through the creation of mission centres and social work agencies, with a freedom to innovate rarely now allowed by the Wesleyan Methodist Conference in terms of independence and the suspension of itinerancy, the Church was challenged to divert its resources and to change radically in its approach to the cities. His slogan was regenerate, 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 both spiritually and materially, in a crusade of social and moral purity, which did not hesitate to use every organ of government, local and national, in support of the so-called nonconformist conscience. This was a natural response to the publication of Andrew Meehan's book, The Bitter Cry of Outcast London, that was in 1883, which awakened the nation's conscience. It basically exposed the whole pattern of the gulf between rich and poor in many of our towns and cities. J.E. Rattenbury later assessed Hughes as primarily a Methodist evangelist with the old message of salvation for sinful men seek, whose forward movement shook Methodism out of her self-complacency and bade her look out on the heathen masses. Rattenbury saw it as a last great attack made on pagan England, a rebuke to the earlier torpidity of red and green baize pews and mahogany pulpits type of religion, which had often ignored the plight of the poor. Victorian Methodists had spent so much money and effort in building bigger and better chapels, Gothic chapels, across the road from Anglican churches, that they hadn't paid as much attention to the needs of the poor. This was a gospel of personal and social redemption in equal measure. The gospel of personal redemption and social reconstruction were to belong together. Hughes' Essential Christianity, 1894, pays tribute to the success of Booth's Salvation Army and criticizes the delusion of socialism, which seeks to meet bodily needs alone, thinking that the social environment was all important. Government, whether central or local, was to be in the service of the people, otherwise it was not Christian. To be a Christian is not to subscribe to the ethical idea of this creed, but to do the will of God, to show the love of Christ in social service. So he pointed to the supreme curse of modern history, which was, in his words, the fatal divorce between personal Christianity and social Christianity. The integration of the church into society was to infuse the ethical teaching of Christ into all aspects of life. It was applicable to business, pleasure, politics, as well as to prayer meetings and sacraments. Much of his message was propagated through the columns of the newspaper that Hughes founded to challenge the more conservative views of the Methodist establishment found in the Methodist Recorder. I daren't pass comment as to which paper survived in the end. His Methodist Times, the voice of the emerging social Christianity emphasis in the church, was widely read by American Methodists as well as British Methodists. While Hughes represented a social but conservative egalitarianism within Wesleyan Methodism, eager to bridge the gap between the church and the working classes, Samuel Keble, a younger minister, epitomized a more radical stream of social Christianity, which eventually broke with Hughes, leading on to a more overt association with socialism and indeed, for some, communism in the 20th century. It was on Keble that a strip of Hughes's mantle fell in the attempt to argue powerfully for the direct application of the ethical standards of Christianity as tests and Christian principles as guides to these social and economic problems. Edwards' biographical sketch of Keble is subtitled "The Rejected Prophet," an indictment of Methodism's reluctance to espouse Keble's more radical program. Yet his socialism was not doctrinaire. He wasn't a Fabian nor a member of the Independent Labour Party formed in the 1890s. Whilst Keble was influenced by Ruskin and Marx, introducing the work of the latter to many Methodists for the first time in the 1880s, Thomson attributes to him the credit for paving the way for a new social gospel in England. Keble read Das Kapital, Marx's work, with enthusiasm, agreeing with many aspects of Marx's social and economic analysis, but thought it marred by, quote, materialistic philosophy, Hegelian jargon, and economic errors. He wrote later that a purified socialism is simply an industrially applied Christianity with a naive earnestness which didn't endear him to many Methodists. Although he maintained the primacy of social Christianity, which professes subordination to no debatable theory, it simply claims to be an effort to apply Christianity to the problems which socialism has neither created nor cured. Many saw in his writing and preaching the socialist agenda. He drew on a ministry in industrial cities in the north of England. He was in Leeds, in Sheffield, and in Manchester, and indeed in my home city of Chester, where he encountered opposition for perceivably preaching politics in the pulpit and talking more about housing than about heaven. In Chester, he described the Methodists as hard to enthuse, lukewarm, discontented, and reactionary. They have no care for social Christianity. I hope things are a little different at Wesley Chester now. Initially, Hughes took him up and engaged him to write a column called Labour Law, that's L-O-R-E, in the Methodist Times, which he edited from 1889 to 1895. Hughes's growing impatience with the stridency of Keble's views led him to prevent publication of an article in the Times on Marx in 1890, with a disclaimer that, quote, our Labour correspondent sometimes expresses strong opinions with which we do not agree. This was perhaps a reference to Keble's attack on employers of the time as, quote, human vampires, and his support for striking workers in docks and factories and on the railways. I wonder what he would say in today's climate. He was a member of a delegation which called on the Prime Minister to campaign for the introduction of an 8-hour day. By 1900, Hughes's autocratic editorial control led Keble to part company with the Methodist Times, and so he produced a rival newspaper, the Methodist Weekly, which lasted for 3 years, an organ which, for challenging the imperialist, anti-Boer, pro-war stance of Hughes and others in the Wesleyan Methodist establishment. So clearly politics divided Methodists, Wesleyan Methodists and others at this time because of the war in South Africa, what became South Africa. Yet Hughes helped Keble to publish his first major book, Industrial Daydreams, when the Methodist book boom turned it down. A series of studies in industrial ethics and economics it is a landmark in the development of nonconformist social radicalism, influencing many Christians like Philip Snowden, who subsequently made a significant contribution to the emerging Labour Party. The book is a stalwart defence of the social gospel against Christian individualism on one side and socialist collectivism on the other, taking on both in equal measure. This is what he wrote. Against Christian individualism, which demands the simple gospel, Christian socialism maintains that the Christian gospel is twofold, individual and social. The social gospel is as sacred and as indispensable as the individual gospel. The two are complementary, and the neglect of either always brings its penalties. From the inspiration of Hughes's forward movement and in the confident spirit of the progress of the Liberal Party in politics, came out the Wesleyan Methodist Union of Social Service. One stream of influence was the so-called nonconformist conscience, the enthusiasm for moral and social reform, which permeated Wesleyanism and indeed much of other Methodism in the 1890s and 1900s. A Wesleyan Methodist Sociological Society had been proposed in 1899, but had few supporters. Keble, with the support of S.F. Collier of the Manchester Mission, persuaded the annual conference meeting at Bristol in 1905 to authorize the creation of the union, modelled on the Anglican Christian Social Union, but with more official status, to try to awaken the social conscience of the Church. This was an important date in the history of a church which traditionally had kept at arm's length issues of social policy in the enforcement of the unwritten but powerful no politics rule. It represented the rising tide of social sympathy in the Wesleyan Methodist Church and buried the legacy of Buntingite hostility to radical politics and social reform for the time being. The union was established to study social science, pursue social service, to discuss social problems, with the view to educate public opinion and secure improvement in the conditions of life. Not unnaturally, Samuel Keble was its first president. The influential John Scott Lidgett, warden of the Bermondsey settlement in London, a sympathetic supporter of social reform and labour affairs, and very active in local city politics in his Progressive Party, was elected as an alderman on London City Council, and he became vice president of the Union of Social Service. J. Ernest Rattenbury, then serving at the Nottingham Mission, subsequently for 18 years at the West London Mission, was a further vice president. W. F. Lofthouse, who taught at Handsworth Theological College in Birmingham, who would emerge as a very significant theologian and apologist for the importance of social ethics and the social agenda, was its secretary. Despite its small membership, in its early years, the union produced some impressive studies which stimulated interest in social service. But its lack of commitment to any particular political party or creed led to disagreement over objectives. Lidgett wanted, in line with Hughes, social reform without socialism, while Keble took progressively a more radical stance and ended up in isolation. The formation of the Sigma Club in 1908, comprising 65 Methodist ministers with a more socialist focus, was in frustration at the failure of the Church to move more quickly, but it provoked the creation of anti-socialist societies within Methodism and nonconformity to counter its limited influence. Nevertheless, The Citizen of Tomorrow, a handbook on social questions, 1906, published at the beginning of the term of office of the Liberal government, when it had its landslide victory, was very well received, selling over 10,000 copies, playing a major educational role in sensitizing the Methodist people to persuade them of the value of social reform and progress. It was followed in 1907 by the ABC Annotated Bibliography on Social Questions, and in 1909, The Social Teaching of the Bible, all of these edited by Keble. And in that year, 1909, a significant conference was held in Oxford by the Union, marking, it claimed, the entry of the Wesleyan Church into the arena of constructive social reform. As well as a keynote speaker address from Scott Lidgett on the church and social problems, it included contributions from Percy Alden, MP, on unemployment, its causes and remedies, and one from Keble himself on the moralization of economic relations. Arguing for the Christianization of social and political life by the churches from their ethical superiority, he addresses himself to employers and workers alike, urging an economic chivalry which would render them less selfish and more conscientious in response to our Lord's golden rule, that is, the law of reciprocity, equality, fairness, and justice, a socialism of the Sermon on the Mount to be taught to the home, the Sunday school, and the church. This sounds very much like a pattern for a justice-seeking church and walking with Micah. This vague but sometimes idealistic communitarian spirit, which experimental religion can provide, is necessary so that ethics and economics are forever joined together by God. Let no man put them asunder. I'll skip a little bit here because there's a lot of detail there, and I hope this will all appear perhaps in the Ranter's Digest at some stage. The rationale of the Wesleyan Methodist Union for Social Service was that it took further the emphasis which the Forward movement had placed on the duty of public service in the fighting for social reconstruction. The long-term effect of the union was felt more by those who served in political life than in the life of the Methodist churches. From a prevailing ethos of seeking after a form of limited collectivism to replace the worst aspects of the laissez-faire politics of earlier liberalism, the political mood of Wesleyanism became divided. This mirrored also the crisis in the Liberal Party, in which it had pinned so many hopes, and the failure to follow up the social welfare policies of Lloyd George, the architect of the radical programme. The Liberals declined to the benefit of the rising Labour Party, whose policies included the nationalisation of the means of production they feared to trust. A number of Methodists joined the new party and abandoned the Liberal Party, which it believed had lost its radical cutting edge. The First World War blunted the impact of the social gospel in Britain by calling into question the Labour leanings and the more pacifist stance of its more radical figures like Keble in what David Bebbington called the Great Reversal. While the social creed in the United States was adopted and expanded by most of the Methodist churches there, the Wesleyan Methodists at home hijacked the movement by creating a Department of Temperance and Social Welfare in 1918, diverting most of its energies in the areas of moral rather than social welfare. The demon drink and the gambler's curse were more worthy of attention than the devils of poverty and unemployment, war and waste. The Wesleyan Methodist Union of Social Service withered on the vine of temperance in 1926. While social gospelers in both American and British Methodism were sensitized to the conditions of workers and cities, they lacked the concise goals and objectives to widen their local concerns. Their social diagnosis and plans for ameliorative action through the central halls and missions established in most cities were more successful than the wider application of a program for social reform, which could be more generally effective. Like Washington Gladden's comment on the American counterpart, it contained primarily a mystical propheticism with practical emphasis. Keble's prophetic isolation was marked after the publication of his last great book in 1921, Christian Responsibility for the Social Order, foreshadowing much that William Temple was to publicize more prominently in the life and work movement in the next decades. Increasingly, Keble became involved with organizations that he was to put his stamp upon, particularly the Conference on Christian Politics, Economics and Citizenships, meeting in 1924, COPEC, and indeed the League of Nations. He moved steadily leftwards with great but unfounded hopes for the collectivist solution. So in conclusion, I'd like to just look at Primitive Methodist parallels to that work within Wesleyan Methodism. In the early 1820s, the Primitive Methodist Conference, meeting at Tunstall, heard Hugh Bourne demanding the expulsion of one of its delegates on the grounds that he was, quote, a speeching radical. He and others feared that the government might withdraw the licenses of preachers. Despite this, Thomas Cooper was one of the early Chartists calling for radical reforms. He, John Skevington, and others rocked the Primitive Methodist boat. Though Skevington was expelled from the connection in 1836, that same year that the preachers were banned by conference from making speeches at political meetings. Only 70 years later, the historian of the Primitive Methodist Church, Kendall, was rehabilitating him and others. Why? Because it was an embarrassment for the church, which now honoured men like Thomas Burt, MP, and other Primitive Methodists prominent in the labour movement, to admit that it hadn't always been so accommodating to reformers and radicals. It's interesting then to discover that at the very time that Kendall was writing this apologia for radicals in Primitive Methodism, the first decade of the 20th century saw the creation of the Primitive Methodist Social Service Union. Writing in 1909, whilst a minister in the Fleetwood circuit, Samuel Horton edited a volume of essays entitled The England of the Future, and wrote the first essay setting out the history of Primitive Methodist involvement in issues of social justice, including the rights of workers. As well as Thomas Burt in the mining industry in the northeast of England, he singles out Joseph Arch and his work in the Midlands in setting up the Agricultural Labourers Union. In defence of the seeming reluctance of the founders of Primitive Methodism to back the reform movement, he reminded his readers that such pioneers helped on the social revolution by claiming the right of freedom of speech in the open air. He also pointed to the work of Thomas Jackson and the Primitive Methodist Minister in the establishment of the Whitechapel Boys' Home, which admitted black youngsters from the East End, as well as social work in city centres such as Edinburgh, where he had served. And I've looked elsewhere at the work of the Whitechapel Mission and indeed the current exhibition on the Primitive Methodism's involvement with the birth of the probation service puts a lot of weight on this aspect of social service being so important for the Primitive Methodists in those early decades of the 20th century. How had the Primitive Methodist Social Service Union come into being? Part of it was about keeping up with the Joneses, as the Wesleyans had set up their own social service union, as we've heard, in the period around 1906. So in that same year, with the encouragement of ministers in the Manchester and Sheffield districts, the Primitive Methodist Social Service Union was formed at the time of the annual conference to study social questions based on objective research, to apply the teachings of Scripture. The outcome would be to promote and encourage all branches of social service inside the churches and within society. In one sense, it was apolitical in that its members belonged to all political creeds and parties or none. But in another sense, it addressed the great political issues of the day and encouraged social service in the churches. It was not a Christian socialist movement, as Horner declared that the present economic system is infinitely better than a Christian socialism, a Christless socialism. A godless democracy would not advanced on a selfish autocracy. Sounds like an essay question for an exam, doesn't it? Discuss. In conclusion, we can't do justice in such a short talk to the importance of these great figures of social Christianity in British Methodism, whether Hughes or Keble or Thomas Jackson within Primitive Methodism. It's nevertheless clear that in the period 1887 to 1921, they made a considerable contribution in their differing ways to the cause of social Christianity in British Methodism, which in turn contributed to the significant development of the social gospel in Britain and the re-evaluation of the place of work in religious life and society, and in the relationship of Methodist churches to the labour movement. From welfare to work was a theme preempted in much of the discussion within Methodism, exposing the fault lines between the individualistic and the collectivist approaches reflected in the preaching and the practice of religious groups in the 20th century. Thank you.